notice that the more you try to be kind, the less people seem to respect you? That your efforts to be understanding, generous, and available are often repaid with silence, dismissal, or even open disregard? It's not just in your head. It's something you feel deep in your body, in the tightness of your chest when you swallow your true response, in the heaviness behind your smile when your words go unheard, in the quiet rage of watching colder, harsher people command more respect than you ever receive. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. It's a truth that no one wants to admit. Kindness, when not paired with strength, often invites disrespect. While you bend to keep the peace, others take the opportunity to push further. While you speak softly, they speak over you. And while you avoid conflict, they exploit your silence. Why? Because in the real world, people are not trained to reward your goodness. They are conditioned to respond to power. Niccolo Machiavelli, writing more than 5 centuries ago, dared to say what still makes people uncomfortable today. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. And while at first that may sound cruel or cynical, look around. You'll see that respect is rarely given to the person who is simply nice. It's given to the one who sets the rules, the one who says no and means it, the one whose presence alone makes others second-guess their behavior. This is the paradox. You were taught that kindness is a virtue, but no one told you that, without boundaries, it becomes a weakness. No one warned you that trying to be loved by everyone would eventually leave you invisible. Or worse, exploited. And if you're feeling that way right now, this isn't just theory, it's your reality. But it doesn't have to be permanent, because the moment you begin to understand this paradox, you gain the power to break it. We have been conditioned to believe that goodness, by itself, guarantees respect. That if we are kind, accommodating, empathetic, and generous, the world will respond in kind, rewarding us with loyalty, admiration, and reciprocity. But this is one of the most dangerous illusions a person can internalize. Because in the real world, kindness without strength does not inspire respect. It invites exploitation. The more you try to please everyone, the more you are seen as someone who can be bent, reshaped, and used. Being good without boundaries is not a virtue, it's a vulnerability. You may have the best of intentions, but if those intentions are not protected by a visible edge, they will be trampled. Human psychology does not operate on pure moral exchange. It operates on power dynamics, on the unspoken evaluation of who can be pushed and who cannot. A kind person who does not impose limits is perceived not as noble, but as easy prey. Machiavelli understood this brutal truth centuries ago, and his words still echo with relevance. It is better to be feared than loved if you must choose between the two. This doesn't mean you need to become cruel or manipulative. It means that your goodness must be guarded by a firm presence. Without that, your kindness will bleed into weakness, and others will interpret it as a lack of self-respect. The world does not reward you for your sacrifices. It respects you only when those sacrifices are made by choice, not compulsion or fear. You must learn to say no, not because you want to hurt others, but because you refuse to hurt yourself. You must step back, not to create distance, but to define where you end and others begin. Respect is not a result of how good you are. It is the result of how seriously you take yourself. And if you don't protect your goodness with strength, others will treat it like an open wound, one they are entitled to touch, test, and tear. Fear and respect are often treated as opposites, but in the real world, they are intertwined in ways that most people are unwilling to admit. Respect does not emerge from goodwill alone, nor from kindness freely given. It is born out of the subtle understanding that certain lines cannot be crossed without consequence. When you establish boundaries with conviction, when your no carries weight and is not followed by explanations or apologies, You are no longer merely liked, you are respected. The human mind is wired to pay attention to what it fears, and this fear, when cultivated with clarity and control, acts not as a weapon, but as a shield. It tells others, "This is my line, and you will not cross it without a price." This does not mean you must intimidate, threaten, or act aggressively. Quite the opposite. True psychological strength rarely needs to shout. It is expressed through calm, through restraint, through the ability to walk away without flinching. It is the gaze that doesn't seek approval, the silence that doesn't beg for peace, and the posture that says more than words ever could. When others realize that you will not bend to please them, that you do not fear discomfort or confrontation, a shift occurs. They begin to tread more carefully. You become a psychological territory marked by caution. And in a world that constantly seeks easy access, this kind of presence becomes rare and therefore valuable. Respect is not something you ask for. It's something you create, not with noise, but with the quiet power of being unmovable. One of the most dangerous forms of emotional imprisonment doesn't come from the outside. It comes from within, disguised as goodness, disguised as empathy, disguised as the desire to be loved. It begins subtly, often in childhood, when you are praised for being agreeable, when you're rewarded for staying quiet, when love is given to you not for who you are, but for how well you adapt to what others expect. Over time, this creates a silent contract in your subconscious that in order to be accepted, you must never disrupt the peace, never say no, never stand too firmly in your own desires. And thus begins the psychological trap Machiavelli would later call self-abandonment, the slow, corrosive process of giving up your own sovereignty in exchange for fleeting approval. This dependency on validation becomes a behavioral reflex. You start saying yes when every fiber in your body wants to say no. You listen to people who don't deserve your attention. You forgive betrayals not because you believe in second chances, but because you are terrified of being seen as unkind. You become the person who shows up, who gives, who understands, who sacrifices, not out of strength, but out of fear. Fear of confrontation, fear of rejection, fear of no longer being liked. And here lies the brutal irony. The more you mold yourself to fit the expectations of others, the more you lose the very thing you're trying to preserve: respect. Because people do not admire those who constantly bend. They exploit them. They test their limits. They take and take again, because you've shown them there are no consequences. In their eyes, your kindness is not strength, it is permission. This emotional servitude isn't a virtue, it is a behavioral addiction. A hunger to be seen as good that renders you incapable of drawing the line. You confuse peacefulness with passivity, and you call it love when it's really self-neglect. Over time, your identity becomes defined not by who you are, but by how useful, agreeable, and inoffensive you are to others. And while they may enjoy your company, they do not fear losing it, because you've never taught them that your presence has a price. True respect cannot coexist with this form of internal abandonment. As long as your self-worth hinges on external validation, you will remain in emotional chains, mistaking servitude for virtue. The more you sacrifice your boundaries to maintain an image of kindness, the more you betray the most important relationship in your life, the one you have with yourself. There is a widespread illusion that being kind is synonymous with being good, that if you simply treat others with empathy, patience, and generosity, the world will eventually return the same energy. But reality, as Machiavelli and centuries of human behavior have proven, is far less poetic. Kindness, when it is not accompanied by discernment and the ability to set firm boundaries, does not elevate your value, it diminishes it. It becomes a signal of vulnerability, not virtue. To be truly kind in this world is not to be endlessly agreeable or perpetually available. It is to embody a version of goodness that knows where it begins and where it must draw the line. Because kindness without strength is not kindness at all. It is compliance masquerading as morality. It is the quiet surrender of your own needs, principles, and voice in the hope that others will finally appreciate your sacrifice. They won't. True, kindness is forged not in blind giving, but in conscious choice. It is the ability to say no with clarity, to withdraw from abusive dynamics without needing to explain yourself, and to remain generous without becoming anyone's emotional servant. It means offering help without being exploited, listening without becoming someone else's dumping ground, forgiving without inviting further harm. Strength gives kindness its backbone. Without it, your goodness becomes bait in a world that smells weakness like blood in water. Machiavelli never condemned kindness itself. He condemned the naive belief that kindness alone would earn respect. What he offered was not cruelty, but realism, the understanding that human nature does not reward pure intention, but responds to posture, to firmness, and to the silent authority of those who carry themselves as someone not to be underestimated. If your kindness lacks that edge, that inner sword of self-worth, it will be seen not as a virtue, but as an invitation to take more. So, if you truly wish to be kind, begin by becoming powerful, not in the aggressive sense of dominance, but in the deeply rooted sense of knowing your value, enforcing your limits, and refusing to let the fear of disapproval shape your behavior. In a world that feeds on emotional submission, the most compassionate thing you can do for yourself and for others is to ensure that your kindness is not a weakness, but a choice made from strength. There is a razor-thin line between commanding respect through fear and becoming the object of resentment. Many who try to impose authority end up tipping too far in one direction. Either they become passive doormats who are continuously violated, or they turn into tyrants whose power is built on intimidation and volatility. But Machiavelli understood something most people still fail to grasp. The most enduring form of authority is not born from aggression, but from a carefully calibrated balance of firmness and emotional control. To be feared without being hated is to create an aura around you, one that warns, without ever threatening, that you are not someone to be trifled with. It's not about shouting, humiliating, or imposing your will with brute force. In fact, the louder you are, the less power you actually hold. True power is quiet. It does not explain itself. It does not chase validation. It simply is, felt in your gaze, your posture, your refusal to justify every boundary you set. Machiavelli warned that while fear can be a useful tool for maintaining control, hatred is a slow poison that accumulates quietly and eventually explodes in rebellion. People may endure fear for a time, but they will never tolerate humiliation forever. The goal, then, is not to instill terror, but to cultivate a measured distance, a psychological perimeter that signals, here, you tread carefully. This balance requires strategic self-awareness. You must act with clarity, maintain emotional consistency, and be willing to make unpopular decisions without seeking approval. You have to build the kind of presence that causes others to think twice before crossing you, not because you lash out, but because they sense there will be a cost. A cost not of revenge or drama, but of withdrawal, of lost access, of your silent detachment, which cuts deeper than any scream ever could. This is the art, to be someone whose absence is feared more than their presence is loved. Not out of cruelty, but because you have made it known, through your actions, not your words, that disrespect has consequences. And this kind of fear, the subtle, almost invisible kind, becomes the foundation of lasting respect. Many people are trapped in behavioral loops they did not consciously choose, but were conditioned into long before they understood what self-respect even meant. These loops are not based on logic, but on survival. From a young age, you may have been taught, whether through words, gestures, or emotional withdrawal, that being accepted depended on how much you could please others. You learned, often without realizing it, that asserting yourself led to punishment, that disagreeing caused emotional distance, and that expressing your needs was something to be ashamed of. So you adapted. You became agreeable, overly polite, always accommodating. You turned silence into a shield and started equating peace with passivity. Every time you said yes when you wanted to scream no, you weren't just compromising in that moment. You were carving deeper grooves into a mental script that told you your voice was dangerous, your needs were secondary, and your discomfort didn't matter. This is not just a bad habit. It is a psychological submission script, one that programs you to trade your integrity for temporary approval and your dignity for conditional affection. Over time, this conditioning hardens into identity. You start to believe that your worth is directly tied to how much you can tolerate, how much you can give, how invisible you can become for the comfort of others. You become the fixer, the forgiver, the one who bends so much that others forget you have a spine. But every time you accept less than you deserve, every time you keep quiet to avoid rejection, you are not keeping peace. You are feeding a silent war inside yourself. And the longer you do it, the louder the resentment becomes, until it either consumes you or explodes outward in a desperate attempt to reclaim the respect you've been starving for. Breaking this cycle is not a matter of learning new behaviors overnight. It is about reprogramming the belief that being kind requires being small. You must start observing the exact situations where your voice dies in your throat, where you instinctively back down to avoid tension. Those moments are your map. They show you where the chains are, and with each act of resistance, no matter how small, you begin to dismantle the mental cage. Not through rage, not through rebellion for its own sake, but through deliberate, grounded defiance against the parts of you that were trained to shrink. This is not easy. It is a slow, often painful awakening. But if you do not reclaim your voice, someone else will always speak over it. If you do not set your own limits, the world will keep pushing until you disappear completely. Internal reprogramming begins when you stop betraying yourself for comfort and start treating self-respect as non-negotiable. Because until you do, no one else will. The most formidable form of power is not the one that announces itself loudly, but the one that is simply felt. A presence that enters the room without explanation, yet shifts the atmosphere entirely. This is what psychologists and strategists alike refer to as latent power, an authority that doesn't need to constantly express itself because its very existence imposes a psychological boundary. People often confuse influence with volume, assuming that commanding attention requires speaking the most or dominating every interaction. But real respect is generated in the space between words, in the calm refusal to explain yourself when tested, in the ability to say no without flinching or needing to justify. Authority is not about being overbearing or aggressive. It is about exuding such unwavering internal certainty that others instinctively know where the line is, without you having to draw it twice. When you carry yourself with emotional discipline and restraint, people begin to think twice before crossing your boundaries, not out of fear of punishment, but out of a deep-seated recognition that your limits are not negotiable. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to argue. You simply make it clear, through your posture, tone, and gaze, that you are not someone to be tested. This silent authority speaks louder than any outburst ever could. It is not a performance. It is a psychological stance, a non-verbal declaration that says, I do not beg for respect. I command it through the integrity of my presence. Those who master this kind of energy do not waste time defending themselves or chasing validation. They understand that by holding firm, calmly, and without theatrics, the message becomes clear. I am not here to be liked. I am here to be respected. And in a world that preys on emotional fragility, this kind of quiet power is not only rare, it is untouchable. As you begin to assert your worth, set firm boundaries, and stop tolerating disrespect disguised as affection, something inevitable will occur. Some people will begin to pull away. They may accuse you of being rude, cold, distant, or even selfish, not because you have changed into something cruel, but because you are no longer willing to be controlled by their expectations. This backlash is not a reflection of your failure, but rather a clear signal that your former compliance had been silently fueling their comfort and dominance. When you shift from passivity to presence, from approval-seeking to self-respect, those who once benefited from your silence will feel destabilized. Their discomfort is not your burden to carry, and their disapproval is not a valid reason to regress into emotional submission. What you are losing is not love. It is the illusion of connection that depended on your self-erasure. Let them leave. Let them be offended. Let them misunderstand. Because what you gain in return is not only clarity, but liberation. You reclaim the energy you used to spend managing everyone's perception of you, and you redirect it toward building an identity rooted in truth, not performance. In this process, you don't just remove toxic relationships, you resurrect your self-respect. You discover that solitude with dignity is far more nourishing than company purchased with self-abandonment. And perhaps, for the first time, you begin to feel what real power tastes like. The kind that doesn't beg to be seen, but commands recognition in silence. There comes a moment, a defining internal shift, where you finally understand that kindness, on its own, is not the shield you once thought it was. You begin to see, often through painful experience, that the world does not automatically reciprocate your empathy, your generosity, or your willingness to forgive. It tolerates it until it no longer serves its interests. And when that point comes, when your kindness no longer offers benefit to others, it is discarded like an expired currency. That's when the brutal realization sets in. Kindness is not immunity. It is not protection. It is only respected when it is backed by something sharper: boundaries, discernment, and the unwavering capacity to walk away. Machiavelli understood this with chilling clarity. His message was never to abandon morality, but to arm it, to dress virtue in armor, not rags. Because in a world governed by self-interest, power is the language that is most fluently understood. If your goodness is not supported by a clear sense of self-worth, by the ability to say no, to withdraw, to refuse to bend, it will be seen not as nobility, but as naivety. You become not a hero, but a soft target. And here lies the true turning point. It is not about becoming cold, heartless, or cynical. It is about becoming complete. It is about understanding that true kindness is not the absence of confrontation, but the ability to remain kind while defending your dignity. When you love, you do so from a place of choice, not obligation. When you help, it is with open eyes, not blind hope. When you forgive, it is not to be liked, but because you are strong enough to do so without forgetting the lesson. You don't become cruel, you become sovereign, the kind of person who can sit in silence and still command a room. The one who no longer pleads for validation because their presence already speaks volumes. And that presence, the quiet, firm, unshakable energy, is what builds lasting respect. Not because others fear your wrath, but because they know you have limits, and you enforce them, without drama, without apology, without hesitation. That is the essence of power. That is the sword your kindness has been waiting for.